Good afternoon. I'm Robert Lieberman, a professor in the Political Science Department at Johns Hopkins University, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Already Authoritarian, Violence, Policing, and Democracy. This session is the third in a series we call Democracy 2020, a project of the American Democracy Collaborative. Thinking clearly and critically about American democracy has never been more important than it is now, at a time when the integrity of our democracy is apparently under threat. The American Democracy Collaborative is a group of political scientists, some of us who study the United States, including previous crises of democracy it has faced, and others who study the conditions that have threatened democracies around the world. We've come together to examine the state of American democracy today. You can read more about our projects at americandemocracycollaborative.org. There you can view recordings of our previous webinars and find information about upcoming events and other projects. I should also add that a recording of today's webinar will be also available there soon. Our next webinar will consider questions about the so-called deep state and its implications for democracy, and we'll be following that up with future sessions leading up to the 2020 election. So to be sure to watch the website for updates. Once again, that's americandemocracycollaborative.org. We're very grateful to Cornell University for making this series possible, particularly the generosity of the Einaudi Center for International Studies and the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. And lastly, we urge you to tweet about the webinar, either as it happens or afterward, using the hashtag Democracy2020. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Rob Mickey, a professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Michigan. Rob is a leading scholar of the history of American democracy and democratization, and we're very grateful to him for joining us today. Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rob. It's an honor to take part in this initiative, and in particular in today's webinar on such a vital, urgent topic. I'd like to introduce our three panelists, all of whom are expert in different elements of policing and how it interacts with politics in democratic countries, whether those democracies are healthy or, as Rob mentioned, democracies facing many challenges. They are first Professor Sabrina Karim. Sabrina, could you wave, please? Sabrina is the assistant professor in the Department of Government at Cornell. She's the co-author of the award-winning book, Equal Opportunity Peacekeeping, Women, Peace, and Security in Post-Conflict Countries. Next is Professor Ayobami Lanianu. Are you waving? Is he waving? There he is. Ayo is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where he studies race, policing, and social inequality. Previously, he worked as senior research scientist at the Center for Policing Equity in New York City, where he worked with police departments around the US to identify and correct racial disparities in the ways police contact civilians and use force. He's published fascinating articles recently on how New York voters responded to the city's stop and frisk program and on how gentrifying neighborhoods are policed. Third and finally is Professor Veshla Weaver. There's Veshla waving. There she is. Veshla is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the Johns Hopkins University. Among her many publications is the book Arresting Citizenship: The Democratic Consequences of American Crime Control with Amy Lerman. Professor Weaver is revolutionizing the study of the political attitudes of Americans living in heavily policed communities, and I'm hoping we get to hear from her about that work and also about its lessons for thinking about American democracy today. Before we hear from the panelists, I just want to remind you, as Rob said, that audience members should use the question and answer box anytime they want to enter questions, and then at about 1:45, we'll start fielding those. To get the ball rolling, I'd like to hear a response from each of the panelists to just to the summer we've had so far. This summer has witnessed, as we all know, widespread protests across the US in response not only to recent killings by police, but also to the centuries-long fact of the often intensive and violent policing of poorer communities of color. Most recently, we had the shooting of Jacob Blake and the murder by a white supremacist of two white protesters of police violence. Local law enforcement has responded to all of these protests in different ways, often brutally. The federal government has even responded forcefully using tear gas to disperse crowds and empowering unidentified law enforcement personnel, some of whom have even used unmarked vans to pick up protesters. This is happening in a nation, of course, that prides itself on the ideals of freedom, limited government, justice before the law, and equality for all. So to kick off our discussion, I just want to get a sense from our panelists, what do you find most striking in all of this? What's surprising? What isn't? Veshla, could you get us started?
Sure, thank you, Rob. And I wanted to thank the folks at Cornell for really putting this all into motion and for inspiring these conversations. So what I find most glaring, there's so much, is that we're seeing in real time, simultaneously, how armed white extremists are confronting a laissez-faire, distant, hands-off response by the state, by police authorities, to storming government buildings with guns, or even handling white militia members, with giving them water bottles and saying, "We appreciate you, we really do," alongside the punishing, crushing of protest when Blacks and their allies have called for simply the right to life, the right to have their bodies not be molested again and again and again, intergenerationally, and across the decades. When they call for the right to not have their communities occupied by police. And so this real-time contrast between violent police responses to the latter versus the ability of some citizens to claim non-interference by government, to claim non-interference and even encouragement by police authorities. And I think the most dramatic recent examples are, of course, police high-fiving white militia groups who gunned down protesters and encouraging them with water bottles, or Idaho police not arresting armed protesters who threatened officials. And normally, because I think of, and we can talk about this, because of the features of our political geography and because of segregation, we don't see this as clearly as we're witnessing it today. We don't see how police differentially enforce the law as clearly, but it is beautifully and tragically showing, I think, a theory of the state in action, a theory of American democracy or American anti-democracy in action, the duality of how the state operates in some communities and for some citizens versus for others. I think the second glaring thing to me is that we built this system democratically, and then we are shocked by it when it reveals itself to violate democratic norms and to violate democratically accountable governance. And yet what I would propose is that the authoritarian methods being used to crush protests were practiced, honed, funded, and allowed by mass publics in the policing of Black neighborhoods, who democratically put in place policies that would render many in Black communities available to be stopped and frisked and picked up on charges of fitting or suspicion of fitting the description. And electoral fears of crime produced the policies that we now see the consequences of, and ever expanding police budgets to deal with problems that are fundamentally about economic precarity. And so I guess I would end by saying that the arbitrary power on display now has been a regular feature of the experience of political authority in Black communities. And the state-sanctioned violence and surveillance of Blacks creates the foundation for the violent responses to protests we now see.
Sorry, that's the first. You're muted. Thank you. Io, how about you? What strikes you in this summer? I know you spent a lot of time thinking and researching about policing as the consequence of democracy, in a sense, as Vesla was getting at.
Yeah, personally, I find to center the activists and the organizations engaged in combating police violence, racism, and white supremacy, right? I find, at a personal level and as someone who's, experienced and viewed many of these events from abroad, just to be incredibly encouraging and inspiring, in the face of indomitable, persistent, pervasive white supremacy and white violence. I'm truly struck by, the courage and the capacity and the history of organizations like Black Youth Project 100, Youth for Justice in Los Angeles, who have been organizing in some of the most dominated environments and communities for decades. As a student, and even as a child, I really appreciate our framing of the conversation around authoritarianism and illiberalism and so on and so forth. As a student and a child, two sort of movements against authoritarian regimes, the narration behind Tiananmen Square, and sort of strangely, the student movement in Serbia that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic, for me, I just found incredibly inspiring. And as I reflect on the protests, the size of the Black Lives Matter movement, its pervasiveness across the United States, I cannot help but be drawn to those organizations organizing in spaces that are thoroughly illiberal and increasingly authoritarian, right? I cannot help but imagine the women of color, right, in Los Angeles and in Chicago, who have lost children to police violence, whose labor and organizing have brought us to this moment, right? It's their labor, their organizing, and their ability to imagine better futures that allow us to think about abolition, that allow us to think about the fundamental restructuring of policing in the United States, and that have, activists, non-activists, Democrats, Republicans, police chiefs, local political leaders talking about radical disinvestment, reinvestment, abolition, so on and so forth. I am truly struck by the number of folks in policing who are talking about shrinking the footprint of policing. Might be the language that you might hear as opposed to abolition or disinvestment. And I'm also struck by, as someone who's located right now in Toronto, Canada, the effect that Black politics in the United States has on Black communities outside of the United States, right? There are Black communities all throughout the Western Hemisphere. There are Black communities in Europe. And in my conversations with activists and political leaders and police leaders in Canada and in the United Kingdom, it is incredible, the sort of transnational effect, right, that the Black Lives Matter movement has had on behaviors, attitudes among Black citizens in these countries and on policy moving forward. So, that to me is truly striking.
Thank you. Sabrina, how about you? You had a third vantage point to help us think about this summer.
Yeah, thank you, Rob, and thanks to everybody for being here. This is a really exciting conversation. Hopefully it won't be too dire. I want to start by saying that I think that the events of this summer, putting them in historical context, it's not new. What we have seen this summer has been going on, and in particular in communities of color, all the time, every day. And so it's, we have to ask ourselves, what was so unique about the summer that it's at the forefront of the media, in early June and then again this past week. But in order to understand that, I think it's important to kind of break down the different types of violence that we've seen and the different kinds of patterns that I think, at least that I've kind of observed, thinking of this in a comparative perspective. So first, the kind of everyday police violence that we have, hear about in terms of, it almost seems like every day when there's somebody that's shot by a police officer. That is oftentimes attributed, at least the police will attribute it to a few bad apples, but we all know that it's institutional racism that's within the organization that's causing this kind of violence. at the organizational level, right? So the individual police officers, because of racist attitudes, racist cultures within police departments, there's that just leads to that kind of violence. But if we just assume that that's the only kind of violence, then what we don't see is that there might be a strategic nature to police violence as well. And so that's actually the second kind of violence that I wanted to talk about. And this is really similar to what Veshla was saying about the kinds of enabling factors. So why is it that the police department enabled the white militia to go and shoot peaceful protesters, gave them water bottles? Why is it that the police did nothing when the militia was allowed to enter into the Michigan state capitol? This to me suggests that there might be a strategic interest in police departments in permitting violence, perhaps delegating violence to militias to uphold their interests, right? Police are strategic actors, they are political actors, they have interests. And so we need to consider that in terms of thinking about maybe there's a strategic element to police violence as well. Thirdly, we saw the use of federal agents, not for the first time, but for the first time when the state did not authorize it in Oregon and potentially other places, Washington, DC, et cetera. So this is the first time. So we have we have the president, the executive, for the first time using federal agents to quote unquote protect property when the state did not ask for such protection. Other times that has happened include enforcing court orders, the federal court orders, or during the Civil War when there's been other resurrections. But that has always happened when the state's governor or other officials have requested that. That to me is one of the most clear signs of a turn towards authoritarianism, and it sets a very dangerous precedent. So these kind of three different types of patterns, I think, are important to separate because they all are chipping away at democracy at different ways.
Thanks. So Sabrina just mentioned that this isn't new. I'd like for us to spend a little bit of time thinking about these events in at least a US historical perspective. So Veshla, Io, what's new here? What's different? We've had lots of long, hot summers of race riots, really pogroms, of police-led violence. What's different now? Veshla, you want to get us going?
Sure. Well, you're asking about sort of historical resonances, or what are the historical precedents? What does this look like when we put it into broader American political historical context? And I would say, at a very broad level, it's the quest for Black citizenship and liberation has always been about the protection of life from coercive institutions, including the police. And there was a little bit of a contradiction implied in your first statement, Rob, when you got us going with your initial framing, which is, you said something like, and all of this is happening in a nation founded on freedom and equality. And I would say that actually, if you look at Black discourse over time and in the present day, Blacks saw this as a feature of American democracy, not a bug. And one of the things, as I was thinking about this question this morning, that I've been thinking about again and again and again, is just what explains how familiar this is, how well-tread Black claims for liberation from police abuse are, and yet the simultaneous failure to learn from and then depart from the past. So you don't need to go very far or deep to see it. So just looking this morning, in an article that was written in 1969, Arthur Waskow writes, during the period from the 1940s to about 1965, when liberal criticism of the police focused on brutality toward Black people, the liberal solutions were psychological screening to exclude sadists, human relations training to soften racial prejudice, professionalization to reduce reliance on naked violence, and civilian review boards to discipline violators of professional norms. All have failed, right? That was written in 1969. And if you look today, you see similarly some of the same, we need training, we need, to eliminate biased policing. In 1977, another scholar predicted that the biggest issue of our day may be one not of how to control crime, but of how to control the police. And we had studies too. So we are all political scientists, one by Eleanor Ostrom and Gordon Whitaker in the AJPS in our flagship journal in 1973 says, our findings strongly suggest that in the area studied, small police forces under local community control are more effective than a large citywide controlled police department in meeting citizen demands for police protection. So why is it that these historic and very clarion calls for a reformed police force, a different kind of police protection, a different response to safety deprivation, have gone so long unheeded that now calls for abolition, while the media may read them as new, you don't need to go back very far in Black historical discourse to find them. They're there. More specifically, of the calls for autonomy from police that have been the centerpiece of Black Lives Matter, sustained police repression of Blacks is an antecedent, has always been an antecedent to the consistent political expression of Black autonomy, self-determination, and communal reliance. This is one of the most established historical precedents, but the least understood, except for a few historians. Calls for Black self-determination are a key anchor of Black politics since Black Power. The call to shift power to police communities back to the communities themselves animates many local political struggles against police throughout the decades of the late 21st and 20th century. Thanks.
Thanks. So Io Veshla is highlighting these clear continuities, almost this Groundhog Day phenomenon the U.S. and particularly Americans of color experience as the political system keeps considering and then failing to do much at all in the face of this. Your opening remarks, though, were a little bit more optimistic. I'm not asking you to be optimistic, but I guess what she's emphasizing continuities. Are there any differences that you think are worth highlighting?
I would say I maintain a personal hope, if sort of a irrational pessimism, because I don't see much changing. I would really echo what Vessel said, that there's more in common with previous moments in history than there is, at least personally, than there is different. Although I'm not quite sure the extent to which at previous moments leaders in policing were talking about a sort of paradigm shift from crime reduction to public safety and public health. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's somewhere in there, in the historical archive for sure. More in common than there is different for sure.
Great, thank you. Certainly since Ferguson, there's been growing concern about the militarization of policing in the US, not just in terms of equipments and weaponry, although that's clear and photogenic, but tactics as well. I was wondering if you all could speak, maybe starting with Sabrina, speak about this issue of the boundaries between the deployment of the military to preserve order, maybe in extraordinary moments, and the the boundary between that and the use of police and to maintain order. Has that boundary blurred in the U.S.? If so, how do we connect that phenomenon to thinking about democracy?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so militarization of the police has been a big a part of the conversation this summer. I think most infamously the 1033 program, which was started under the Clinton administration, which basically authorized excess military equipment to give to any law enforcement agency, including law enforcement that is in schools, that requested it for free. They just needed to go and pick up the material and bring it home. There's obviously lots of problems with this. While a number of the items were, things like table and chairs, a lot of it was also military equipment that was designed for counterinsurgency. There is an intimate link between the policing in the US and counterinsurgency strategy, US counterinsurgency strategy. So the 1033 program, provided counterinsurgency vehicles, so MRAPs, for example. You can look up what that looks like. It's pretty scary. Which were actually a failure for counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we have a failed vehicle that is a very scary thing that is now in American streets that was meant for counterinsurgency being used by police. So that is one way that we see militarization. There's other ways as well. One of the things that police departments do is hire veterans. There's often many programs that try to hire veterans. So you have people with the mindset of the military who are police officers. Now, some might say maybe there's pros to that. That's a question somebody can ask me later. And then there's also the culture. If anybody has read Stuart Schrader's book, I highly recommend it, called Badges Without Borders. It highlights just how closely American policing is related to counterinsurgency and how the same people that were developing counterinsurgency policy in places like Vietnam were the ones responsible for advising policing within the US. So those are just a few ways. I will highlight, I maybe just end by saying the US is one of the most militarized police in the world, not the only one, but definitely far different from places like in Europe, in which many of the police departments don't even carry guns, and rely mostly on peace officers. And so we have a very different kind of policing. There's other ways that the US policing is different. Maybe that's a question that we can ask later. And one of the reasons for that is because of the decentralized nature of our policing system, as opposed to, we don't have a federal police, but I can talk about that later. Thanks.
If I can jump in on that, and I'm glad Sabrina mentioned Stuart Schrader's new book, which really shows us the links between global policing and, counterinsurgency efforts and domestic policing. But also, I think in this conversation around police militarization, it often tends to seem like a deracialized, well, we just invested a lot of heavy military equipment in police forces. And we forget that our initial efforts at police militarization in this country can be traced back to surveillance of the Black Panther Party. I mean, if you look at the very first SWAT teams in this country, first deployed in Los Angeles in reaction in 1969. It sent 300 officers, battering rams, tear gas, army tanks into the Panther headquarters. And I think also, this understanding of, and this kind of goes back to the question you were asking earlier, Rob, about sort of what are the historical continuities and precedents versus the differences. I do tend to see more similarities than differences. I mean, if you look at police behavior today towards protesters and police behavior in, say, 1967 in Detroit, or in Crown Heights, or in any of the number of local challenges to police authority and normally challenges that came out of police killing a young Black person, you can see how deeply, how much the similarity they share. So, you know, police reacting violently in retaliatory ways in Detroit, 1967. I just went and looked this up, and police said to a Black protester, "We're going to kill all you black ass N-word pimps and throw you in the river. We're going to fill up the Detroit River with all you pimps and whores," right? This is, so today, a lot of us are showing shock at how police retaliation against protesters and sort of the violent tactics that are being used. But this is incredibly consistent with how police have responded to mainly Black protests in the past. I think the difference today is that we're seeing them use the tactics on white protesters. So why is it when the same tactics that are used against Blacks migrate to white protesters, then we're ready to call them authoritarian, right? But we're not prepared to do so when they just sort of, you know, surround the everyday lives of Black and brown communities.
You know, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of bring up, you know, things or history from the Canadian context. One of the things that I really appreciate about this authoritarian framing is that it disrupts the American exceptionalism, the initial framing that we've had, right? So the Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties that, you know, as we know them in the United States, right, were initially, you know, their first job in Canada was to clear land purchased by the federal government from the Hudson Bay Company of Indian, Aboriginal, and Métis people, right? So you can imagine if there was a police force that forced the Cherokee out of Georgia, a Trail of Tears police force, and that became effectively the symbol of policing in America, right? That's in this, you know, the true North, quote unquote, in Canada. And so, you know, I've worked actually with police data here, with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and, you know, the disparities that we see in terms of use of force, serious injury, deaths in custody, sexual assault by police of persons of color, the magnitude of the disparity is the same, right? So, of course, you know, we know that there are about 1,000, 1,100 police killings of citizens of the United States, and in Canada, that number might be around like 40 or 50, right? But the disparity, you know, the estimated disparity is about the same, right? So clearly the United States is exceptional, right, in its violence, right? But in terms of its treatment of people of color, in terms of its treatment of Indigenous persons, you know, I would strenuously argue that it is not exceptional, and that we should be thinking about these things in comparative terms.
Thank you. And maybe in particular in kind of settler colonial polity perspective, right? I mean, I would just interject that the first serious policing in the present day US by European settlers, or at least English settlers, was the pressing into duty of all young white men in working in slave patrols, right? And actually handing out weapons, the use of the state budget to arm men for this mandatory duty, right? So let's come back to the theme of all of these great Cornell webinars, which is thinking about the implications of this for U.S. democracy. Or Veshla, it's fine if you just want to say, or not democracy, but how about the American regime, whatever we want to call it. Right? I'm just wondering how you guys want to think about the events of this summer, how they relate to other recent trends in American democracy, or the kind of broader challenges we think of American democracy is facing. Mass partisan polarization, vast and rising economic inequality, many white Americans panic about losing their status as the demographic majority. Are these broader challenges helping produce the policing and the protests we're seeing now? Are they shaping Americans' responses to these, to policing and protests? How do we fit these together? Somebody want to jump in? Y'all are like my summer school class. Somebody want to jump in?
Well, I'll jump
There we
in.
go.
It's a great question, and I think it's something that all of us have struggled with as political scientists. There's sort of this bifurcation in the academy between people who focus on, you know, the trends that you just mentioned, Rob, right? Declining trust in democratic institutions, you know, rising polarization, extreme levels of inequality. And one of the things that I have been sort of pushing is we tend to isolate those things, and we tend to see those things as being, you know, as raising questions about how healthy our democracy is. And yet we have historically separated those questions from questions of state oppression. And I don't think that we should. I think that we have glamorized and sanitized and promoted a very salutary view of American democracy as the ideal against which the rest of the world is judged. And if you look to actual lived experience of state authority in actual communities, what you will very quickly see is that they do not describe living in a, you know, a democracy that values their voice, a democracy that leaves them alone, a democracy that doesn't dominate them. And so ought we begin to really question the extensiveness of American democracy for some communities. And so one of the concepts I've been talking a lot about lately is a concept called racial authoritarianism, that there is a different experience of government happening from below, and it's very easy to see. It's, you know, they talk about police occupation of their neighborhoods. So one, you know, just one quote from this larger, in my introduction, Rob, you mentioned my work on sort of collecting the largest archive of policing narratives by the policed. And, you know, just looking at one right now, one person says, we're constantly under police surveillance. There's huge police lights in our communities. I'm talking about like military grade equipment in people's neighborhoods, and not just anyone's neighborhoods, Black people's neighborhoods, Latino people's neighborhoods, low income people's neighborhoods. People can't live like this. And another one goes on to say that to basically describe their community as being an enemy combatant. How this government, our government, responds to riots, and when Black people are hurt and we feel like we have to uplift our voice, instead of like being empathetic and compassionate, like they sent the military or their SWAT teams at us. And like, you know, it's almost like we're invaders at that point. In your own city, at any time, you can be killed by your own soldier. That's how it feels like in America. So I think when we begin to think about, well, what are the broader implications of all of this for how we understand, how we assess how robust our democracy is, we have to attend to how people actually live and experience it. It's one thing to have laws on the books that tell you that you can't be searched arbitrarily, that tell you that a police officer can't just arbitrarily come into your home. It's another thing to actually live policing as though you are an enemy combatant.
Thank you. Sabrina?
Sure. So I was just going to try to answer that question by bringing it back to the framework that I had mentioned in the intro, which is that kind of separating out these three different patterns, if you will, of police violence. And so I think what's maybe the most scary, or what I guess that might, you know, I'll just say scary because it is scary, is that during the summer, we saw all three of these patterns. So the first one that I mentioned again was just the organizational culture of the police being racist, sexist, etc. You know, that's obviously going to lead to violence. But what's really concerning is the other two. So we live in a country where policing is decentralized, which means that there are thousands of police departments that have their own authority. And on one hand, that makes it very hard for a executive to co-opt a police department because there's some, it's so decentralized. But that leads to much less accountability for any one police department. And so if you are seeing that police departments do have strategic interests that they do because they each want to maintain the status quo because they live in a world in which they're getting a majority of the resources from a city or county government. They receive quite a bit of resources. They want to maintain those resources. So they want to maintain the status quo. So if they are now going to align with militias to maintain the status quo and in a kind of a white supremacist order, if you want to tie in what Veshel was saying, then this is quite problematic because, and I don't think this is new. I think historically the police have aligned with militias in the past. But if we see a rise of that again, that's quite problematic, as well as the co-optation of any kind of federal agencies by the executive, as we saw this summer as well, President Trump using federal authorities to police the state. So those two trends to me signal this more of a push towards authoritarianism or chipping away at democracy at different ways.
Thanks. Ayo?
Yeah, just briefly, I'm quite curious about, frankly and narrowly, turnout in November and the effect of protest participation, experiences of police brutality in these different states, the sort of demographic composition of who was protesting and where, whether all else being equal, we should expect, individuals who now support the Black Lives Matter movement, who are white and were brutalized by the police, right? Like what sort of effect should we expect in local turnout, local races in November? What some of my work touched on, but given the urgency of, or given what's at stake in the November election, a lot of my thinking goes somewhat narrowly to that point. But it's frankly, it's a big question mark for me.
Veshel, I couldn't tell from that nodding if you wanted to say something. No? Okay. I want to hear from you all your answers to the Leninist question, what is to be done? But first, maybe we could just table that and start hearing a little bit from the audience. So this first question, it reads as follows. Panelists have mentioned the state as an actor. Do you find that these problems are caused mostly by the current administration, or is this administration no different than prior ones? Anybody want to jump in?
So I think there's similarities and differences. I like Veshel outlined, and as we know, police violence and the types of violence that we see in minority communities is not new. So Democratic and Republican presidents are just as guilty as anyone else. And I should mention that it's not just limited to African-American communities, but we're talking about indigenous communities. So the immense militarized response to Standing Rock, for example, with the indigenous rights movement, the strong policing of LGBTQ communities, strong policing of Latino communities, et cetera, all of that. I mean, it's historically it's done by the right, the left, everybody is sanctioned it or allowed it to happen. What again, I think is different is that there's been, it's always been sanctioned and authorized by lack of accountability as opposed to a mandate by the executive. That's maybe, then that's why I keep alluding back to that as kind of being, to me, the yellow flag for this particular year.
Yeah, Veshel, when you say the state, do you mean the federal government? Do you mean the government at any level of the polity? How are you thinking about this?
When I say the state, I mean it most directly as local political authority, right? Local police. Of course, they have the backing of state and federal government, and the federal government sometimes, in the Obama administration, when Obama left office, I think there were, 21 or, just under 24 cities under federal oversight for police malpractice, for police abuse, for unconstitutional policing, including my own city of Baltimore. So when I say the state, and I think this is one of the problems, is we tend to think of authoritarianism as being directed by a central, dominant national leader, and not, Rob, your own work has so forcefully shown that you can have subnational authoritarianism within the United States. It's exactly what citizens living under Jim Crow experienced, right? You call it authoritarian enclaves, right? Areas where you can have a national, federal democracy. You can have, and it's perfectly compatible with a federal democracy, but local authoritarian rule, right? No political competition, no party competition, a one-party South, high levels of political violence, high levels of the citizenry not being allowed to vote and cast a ballot. And one of the things that has enabled is getting us a bit away from this definition, predominant in our literatures, of authoritarianism being just a top-down, executive that wants to cede power to himself, that wants to control the bureaucracy, that wants to put in place loyalists, and instead see that citizens in this country can experience a locally driven, dispersed, authoritarian experience of power, experience of government through the police. And we have created a situation where we so invested in policing through democratic means, I should say. So this authoritarianism is actually perfectly compatible with local popular democracy, right? We enabled this, we voted it in. And then you get a situation where it's hard to rein in police once you've invested, in them that kind of power and that kind of autonomy. So what's interesting to me is the inability of powerful lawmakers today and city officials to restrain their own police forces, to restrain police abuse. And it highlights how independently and how insulated from oversight and control the police have become, as a sort of ungovernable bureaucratic actor that has its own political interests and that is relatively insulated from democratic control, even though we got that way through normal democratic politics.
Right, and I think it's useful to, when most Americans who are concerned about American democracy think of the main challenge, or at least, the main challenge to American democracy being the National Republican Party. But if you take to heart what Veshla is saying, at the local level, almost all of these cities are ruled by capital D Democratic officials, right? They're lower D Democratic, as Iowa's work has shown. They're voters asking for things and getting them, but it's Democratic Party officials and local authorities who are providing this this other kind of threat to democracy. Sabrina, here's a question for you. From an outsider's perspective, it seems like the militarization of policing in the US and the delegation of violence to the militia is intimately tied to how the Second Amendment has been interpreted. Do you think this is a fair observation? And if so, does police reform also require constitutional reform?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the arms race, the militarization of the policing is related to the Second Amendment in the sense that that's the reason that the police give for militarization. So they say, well, these communities, there's so many guns in these communities, we need bigger and better guns than what they have. And that creates essentially a bit of an arms race, except for that it's racist in the sense that you have militias that are allowed to have, white militias, I should say, allowed to have guns and display them and adhere to the Second Amendment, have their Second Amendment rights held up. And the police, for some reason, are not afraid of that, right? They're not afraid, they don't need to have an arms race with the white militias, but it's only this perceived threat of weapons that exist in minority communities. So this idea that there is an arms race, has led to that justifies the militarization of the police. And I would say that it would be very difficult to take away the militarization, to take away the guns from the streets if we don't have an amendment to the Constitution. So they're already out there.
Thank you. Real quick, someone mentions that claiming that the US is already authoritarian may be false and even counterproductive to claim. Does the authoritarian label risk belittling the suffering of people living under real authoritarian regimes where political violence would leave citizens with virtually no recourse? Practically, talking like this can backfire if people perceive a mismatch between authoritarian alarmism and reality. Maybe they'll conclude that other claims about the Trump administration's overreach are possibly false as well. What do you all think about that? Joshua, are you going to stop nodding and talking?
I'm thinking about that question. It's a great question, and I think it's something that we shouldn't flatten the comparisons by using the term. I do not mean to flatten the experience, the very different experience of people living under military rule or living under despotic power. That said, and I always find this hard to do without actually reading quotes from actual oral histories of American citizens who describe living under a government that bears no resemblance to what I was taught in grade school or secondary school about what government is through American civics textbooks. That bears no resemblance, where people will outright say the Constitution gives us this, that, and the other right. But let me tell you how it actually works in my community. You never get due process. You're going to be stopped and harassed at the tender age of 10, 11, 12. You cannot claim to be on your front porch without police circling and asking what you're doing there. You can't walk to a park to play basketball or baseball without being asked to see your ID by police. So I agree that it is not the same as living under a central, it's not the same as living under a dictatorship or under, I've been doing a lot of reading lately about policing in kind of newly democratic or post-authoritarian countries, right? It's not the same. The levels of torture and disappearances are not the same. But I think of this more as a continuum than as a dichotomy. I'm thinking about this more as there are communities within our country whose experience of democracy has some resonances and some similarities and begins to feel like it is more similar to people living under states where there's high levels of violence against the citizenry. And so how do we think about that? Yes, I agree, we shouldn't flatten the distinctions. We shouldn't belittle the experiences of people who simply cannot vote or simply, or where military rule is, established within their constitutions, right? But at the same time, I think in this country, we have too often political observers, journalists, academics, the lay public holds up an idealized version of our democracy that simply does not jive. It is out of sync with what actual oral histories and archival accounts of how people experience that democracy when they come from race, class, subjugated communities. And we have to attend to that. And so maybe authoritarian isn't the right conceptual category. I do think that racial authoritarianism is perhaps a good conceptual innovation that we can use.
Can I just quickly add that I don't think that it's mutually exclusive. Like you can have both at the same time, and that's what I fear is starting to happen, or that's the fear that I have from the events of the summer, is that we've seen this racial authoritarianism as a result of racism, organizational or institutional racism, and also potentially the strategic actions of the police. But like that's potentially a reason for the racial authoritarianism, but that's not mutually exclusive to actual authoritarianism. You can see both happening.
Great, thanks. I just want to note to the audience that, sorry, we're kind of overflowing with great questions. We've got, I think, 18 minutes left. So yeah, so we're all good on those, thanks. So on this issue of authoritarianism, we got an interesting question that I'd like to direct Ayo's way to start out, and that is, can you talk about the role of police unions in all of this? And the question asker makes a great point. Traditionally, she says, I think of unions as a way to combat authoritarianism, but in this case, they seem to be aiding and abetting it. So what's the role of unions in all of this?
As far as research demonstrates, police unions exercise an incredible amount of power, right, an incredible amount of control in protecting police officers when they engage in misconduct, prevents civilian oversight, right? So they will argue for, a lack of civilian oversight, right? They're, the union is able to mobilize, or is effective at mobilizing its members in terms of supporting particular political candidates, right? So in terms of at the local level, preventing the sorts of reforms that protesters and demonstrators would like to see, right? Police unions exert an incredible amount of power. Recently, I can't recall if it was enacted, but my understanding is that the national labor federations and organizations are reconsidering the membership of police unions, right? Because of this issue, because of the contradiction that the questioner identified, right? That said, there are, in terms of legislation, in terms of state policy, in terms of federal oversight, in terms of state level accreditation, which some folks have interestingly identified to the particular place within which we can insert community oversight and community control. At all levels, police are insulated from democratic accountability, and fixing such that addressing the police unions or depowering police unions isn't the silver bullet that some folks might imagine, right? Police are protected in municipal policy, state policy, federal oversight, and in the courts, right? It is truly a systemic, cross-institutional sort of arrangement that allows the sort of capricious violence against people of color to take place in the United States. So absolutely, police unions are part of the equation, but addressing them or contesting them, in my opinion, is no silver bullet to this problem.
Any other thoughts on place of unions? All you progressives allegedly love unions. I don't know what's going on here. It's interesting even to think about the impact of unions on sentencing policy. So I think of Josh Page's fascinating book on the policy influence of California Prison Guards Union on, I think it was the mandatory minimums in California, especially, I'm not sure. So we have a similar question here. with the history of police brutality and policing disparities, I guess racial disparities in police behavior, how can police departments appropriately respond to some of the non-peaceful and potentially violent protests that threaten property? What can be done differently in the future? So this is, I guess, not so much about day-to-day policing, but the policing of protest.
Sure. I think as we reimagine what the police might look like in the future, many of the proposals that I've read and that are the most compelling to me are to significantly and dramatically shrink the police's role to engaging or being deployed when there are clear moments where harm to persons can be done. Right, so like Alex Vitale does a great job of describing this, that the police are violence workers, that they are trained in violence, that they are trained to control situations through violence or threat of violence, and that in instances where there's threat to like physical life, that's that may be the only situation where the police as we know them constituted right now should be deployed. Right, thinking about, how should we respond to, day-to-day sort of petty threat to property, so on and so forth. My sense is that armed members, paramilitary individuals should not be deployed to those calls, right? Vandalism, there are other institutions, other persons, we can imagine other agencies that could respond to those sorts of calls. In the situation, in a situation where there's large-scale protests against police violence, and a few rogue actors or engage in damage to property, I still don't think that the sort of response that we observed this summer is justified or appropriate, right? I think there are a variety of preventative measures that one could take, or a variety of ways of sort of like reconstituting even police as violence workers, or that could be simultaneously more effective and maintain public health and public safety, right?
I mean, just add that I think this is where the militarization bit is really evident. If you look at any picture from this summer and you see you can it looks like a war zone. The police are out there thinking that they're ready for battle. They're in fatigues. They have the armor. They have the equipment, the MRAPs, and that's what they're coming to with against civilian protesters. It's a mindset of militarization. And what does that mean? That means that instead of trying to resolve a conflict peacefully, they're trained and their mindset is all about violence, right? So the first thing should be allowing protesters to protest. There's no reason to escalate, but when the police show up in such a militarized form, it escalates the situation. So a lot of the times when we hear about violence as resulting from these protests, they start peaceful, but the escalators are actually the police. The police are the ones escalating the situation by showing up in such a militarized form. They make it a battle, as opposed to it often being started by the peaceful protest.
So I think all of you in different ways have talked about American policing as a policy outcome as having lowercase d democratic roots. It's something that it's a policy secured by people with influence who wanted it. So one question asker notes, how can we explain why that is and why state and local Democrats are unwilling or unable to rein it in despite campaigning on reform? Is the answer psychological racism of police, voters, and politicians? Or is it the police are protecting property? Or is it the police or a paramilitary operation?
I'll jump in on that. Oh no, go ahead, Sabrina.
No, I was just going to ask, well, I can start where I think. So the one thing that we haven't, well, I think you started the conversation in a more optimistic way today, but was about the other thing that happened this summer, which was the huge swelling and change in public opinion and kind of enthusiasm for change and reform. So this is the biggest movement in American history, the Black Lives Matter movement. So, you know, there were more people peacefully protesting for this movement than any other time in history, which is amazing. And I think we forget that this is probably an immense political opportunity for reform. And so I think one of the reasons we might not have seen change amongst, you know, Democratic city officials or democratically elected Democrats, big D, is because there was never such a big push this big that kind of gives them a mandate to make change. And so I guess the more optimistic note would be that this is an opportunity to make changes, and we are seeing cities make changes. Now, they might be superficial changes. We can get to, you know, what reimagining the police actually should look like, as opposed to, you know, things like oversight, increased oversight or improved training, which has been tried and failed. But this could potentially be an opportunity because of what we've seen. We've seen the movement grow so big.
I agree with all of that, Sabrina. I think, you know, to Jake's question, how can we explain why we have policing structured the way it is, why it's producing these outcomes, why has it failed time and time again? You know, we've had so many reform episodes, and in fact, on the heels of many of those reform episodes, we have not, not only have we not scaled back policing, we have abetted it. We have invested more heavily in policing. And so some of our biggest police innovations over the last, you know, 30, 40, 50 years have come in response to waves of protest. And I think that's my biggest fear in this moment, is that we will yield yet another round of proceduralism, fixes, trainings, and I think it's the reason why Black Lives Matter and Black political organizing on the ground in many of these places is saying no more reform. We need something different. I think part of the answer to his question is, you know, has been stated before, which is that police are powerful political actors. Local elected officials have felt constrained in either their rhetoric or their actions to reform police, to remove police. You know, if you look at the history of you know, investigations of police abuse, it's very difficult, right? It's the reason why people were so astounded when the shooter of Laquan McDonald was actually found guilty, because it's historically very improbable that courts held police who had engaged in serious abuse and fatalistic interventions in Black communities were held to account. Oftentimes they were moved to other jurisdictions. Sometimes they were given promotions. So what explains that? I think police power explains that. I think until recently, it was a liability politically to be seen as soft on crime. And I think more broadly, you know, we have so stripped down other kinds of responses to safety deprivation that the thing that we have in this country, unlike in the UK, unlike in some of our Western European counterparts who have much more extensive welfare states, what we have are police agencies. And I encountered this, you know, this is just a very direct example. But the other day, I'm in, you know, Walgreens fulfilling a prescription, and a man who was homeless wanted me to buy him some soap. And I wanted to buy him some soap, and he goes over to the soap, and it's behind lock and key, behind a plastic barrier. And he gets irritated with the Walgreens clerk who won't open it for him. And she calls the police. And he's done no crime. And I ask her, well, why did you call the police? I'm willing to buy him the soap. It's a $4 pack of Coast. He's clearly just trying to live. And she says to me, and this is a young Black woman clerk. She says, because if I call, Baltimore Behavioral Health or Mental Crisis or any other agency, they're not going to show up in time. I need this guy gone, and I know the police will show up. So in the midst of a nationwide global protest movement, one of the largest in history, her first response is to call the bureaucratic agency that's gonna show up. And the reason that bureaucratic agency is gonna show up is that our nation has invested heavily in policing infrastructure as a first resort to all manner of social and economic problems. So I halfway understand why her response was she's just trying to get through her shift. And so lo and behold, 2 police show up and they interrogate the man, right? This is not the response. This is a response that has been politically and historically built up over decades, right? Elizabeth Hinton goes into this extensively in her book about how we shifted from a war on poverty to a war on crime, and how as the agencies meant to uplift communities suffering safety deprivation and disparity were basically struck down and disinvested in, we create this large policing infrastructure as a response to handle all manner of social problems.
I just want to interject really briefly, just to kind of remind folks that that it's not all negative, right? So, in terms of, failures, it's important to keep in mind the victories that local organizations have fought for and have been able to achieve in many of these cities, that for a long time, folks were asking for community policing, and they secured community policing, and we learned that it was a failure, that it didn't do the job. Folks were asking for body cameras, and we learned, evaluated the program, it's not sufficient, okay? And so I think, now folks are demanding shrinking the footprint, right? Abolition, reinvestment. And, as horrible as it is, right, one can be hopeful, if not optimistic, right? Especially for, thinking narratively about that question about, folks who have campaigned on reform, or folks who are, seem about reform, right? I think that these people are fighting for reform, and they have been successful in the past, and in our sort of like, and in this moment, and in our framing of authoritarianism, I remember Tank Man in Tiananmen Square, so on and so forth, right? In the face of, improbable odds, right, that these sorts of things are possible. So, there shouldn't be an erasure of the successes that certain political actors have had combating this sort of policing, for sure. But
can I just, because you're okay, so can you tell me what those successes have been?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, the one that comes to mind immediately is the passage in Minneapolis, right, to abolish the police, even though it was kind of stymied by that local committee, I guess. But at the same time, I'm thinking about the variety of cities where police now, responding to protests in 2014 and 2015, equipped their police officers with body cameras, right? Because the sense among maybe not all activists, right, but increasing number of people was that if one way to hold police officers accountable, and I think there's an understanding that there's an accountability issue here, is that if we equip them with body cameras, then the evidence will be there, right? What's holding police officers accountable now is cell phone footage, and to make that universal would give citizens the power to hold police officers accountable. And it's it hasn't been it has failed, and it hasn't been able to secure what folks want rapidly enough. Right, and so I think that with an increasing number of folks asking for a shrinking of the footprint. So what you're talking about with mental health, folks in mental health crisis, right? I think, police chiefs agree, right, that police officers aren't effective at dealing with individuals with serious mental health crisis, right? Activists wanted, there's a model out there in the Pacific Northwest, both in Cahoots, where this thing is effective, right? So, I'm hopeful that, at the very least, that sort of Cahoots model might be implemented in more and more cities. But I think, I think we can identify organizations like, particularly like BYP 100 and Youth for Justice, right, that have some track record of, ending solitary confinement for young people or reducing levels of violence, right, or at the very least, empowering and strengthening individuals who have suffered from that violence, right, and getting them back into the political sphere, right? So, again, I would characterize my disposition as hopeful, not optimistic, right? But as a sort of narrow response to Jake's question, I would not want to erase instances of political success.
So we're 2 minutes over. I just want to see if Sabrina, no pressure, but if you have any wrap-up thoughts on the what is to be done question, love to hear them.
$1 million question, right? No, I think it's important that whatever does result from all of the activism that we've seen this summer, one, it's important that the momentum doesn't get lost, and to keep putting on the political pressure, because that is what's going to give the mandate to the politicians to make changes, to support the groups, all the groups that if it weren't for civil society, we wouldn't be seeing these kinds of changes, and holding people accountable, holding police departments accountable. But I do think that the kind of the approaches that we've seen in the past and continue to see, even the ones that activists call for, the bare minimum, the 8 can't wait standards, etc. Those are all bandages to a more systemic problem that includes not just police reform, but it includes healthcare reform. It includes reform in education and in the fundamental social services in our country, because none of these all of these problems are interlinked, and you can't really reform just one aspect of it without really thinking about the big picture. And I think if we're going to strengthen democracy, we need to strengthen democracy for everyone, and that's just not about policing. It's about making sure everybody lives a dignified, making sure that everybody is able to live a dignified life in which, all these freedoms are possible for everyone. So that would be my concluding statement.
Thank you. Veshel, let me give you the last word here.
Oh, that's a tall order. I guess when I think about this moment, I agree with Io that there is this is the first moment in my lifetime where I truly feel transformation is possible, where discourses of something different than proceduralism are suddenly unapologetically being embraced, being held up, being this, abolitionism used to be sort of a very non-mainstream political demand. And we're seeing that now. I have neighbors that are embracing it in a way that I never thought possible. I am worried, as I said before, that we will repeat the past. We will proceduralize our way beyond the worst of the worst abuses while maintaining a system that is nevertheless, controlling, abusive, humiliating, denigrating of citizenship. I think a lot of the reforms focus far too heavily on outright explicit police violence. So imagine if we enact policies to stop chokeholds, to train police in de-escalation, to limit the use of force, to limit how police can engage citizens. The more mundane violence, and I say that explicitly, of a police encounter that features no outright violence still remains. So the majority of police-citizen encounters and interactions, leave no paper trail, right? If I'm just stopped by, if my son is stopped by police and nothing further happens, most cities do not even record or provide publicly accessible data on that encounter. And yet that's the majority of how people are encountering police. And many scholars have shown that just because that encounter ends without an arrest or without a sanction or without physical violence, it is nevertheless incredibly corrosive to dignity, to what people learn about the state, what people learn about their own citizenship, how people then adapt to moving through public space, what kinds of places they avoid, what kinds of normal constitutional behaviors that they avoid because for fear of being stopped by police. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, in this moment, we also need to attend to police encounters that do not feature violence, right? The lack of attention to policing of Blacks that don't feature violence or ended life concerns me. You know, so many are outraged at police killings, but the public goods that are enjoyed, the public goods by American citizens, rely on a controlling police power, on a segregating police power. Police segregate space, they expel undesirable people from communities. They maintain social hierarchies, they maintain an economic status quo that delivers some benefits to and some good neighborhoods to some people and constrains life in other neighborhoods. And so I think until we can have that conversation, we won't get to the transformative agenda that's possible.
We won't get to the democratic agenda that's possible. That's exactly right. All right. Sorry, we're 7 minutes over. We had over 25 questions today and many more in advance. We regret we didn't have time to get to all of them. Just speaking for myself, I'm grateful to the Einaudi Center at Cornell for hosting this, for the great panelists, and for you, the audience, for making this such a rich discussion. Thank you very much.